So remember in our last part of chapter 12, we were looking at the evolution of cooperative behavior and altruism, or what appears to be altruism, in prairie dogs and ground squirrels, where they have this alarm call. And we think that this alarm call behavior is arising through kin selection, and what is happening is these individuals are actually increasing their indirect fitness by helping. So rather than this being something that is difficult to explain by selection, it's actually fairly easy to explain, because you do leave more genes in the future if you help individuals that are related to you.
Alan! 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 Al! Alan!
She's all neck and legs, look at her.
Oh, I am looking at her.
Stop looking at her.
You just told me to look at her.
Ow!
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 Ow! That's right in my throat, that. Alan! 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 Oh, so that's not Alan. Steve.
Now we're going to continue our chapter on social behavior by looking at a phenomena known as helpers at the nest. And helpers at the nest represent individuals like you see here on the right is a Florida scrub jay. Over here on the left you see a chough. And what they do is the juveniles will help their parents raise offspring, which are their siblings, and in some cases they will eventually take over part of the mom and dad's territory and be able to raise their own offspring, but in many cases they might not. In many cases they might just raise siblings their whole life, and they'll get some indirect fitness, but they won't have any direct fitness. So we're going to see a short video on these Florida scrub jays.
Food is so scarce that more than 2 adults are needed to search for it if a nest full of chicks is to be kept supplied. This bird is not the parent of these nestlings. It's one of last year's chicks who has stayed on to help raise this year's brood. Young female helpers, after a year or 2, usually leave to look for territories of their own, but young males may stay on for as long as 7 years. One of them may eventually inherit the family estate and nesting site when the old breeding male dies, but most will never father a brood. Instead of producing their own young, they find their reproductive reward in helping to raise their younger brothers and sisters. Guarding the food supply is just as important as collecting it, and some of the young helpers act as sentinels, keeping an eye out for thieves. This is a trespasser from a neighbouring territory, sneaking in to try and steal food. That can't be allowed. Back to normal duties. Another intruder, an indigo snake. It too is hungry, and the meal it is searching for could well be a jay chick. So, teamwork saves the nest. Indeed, as a result of studies here, we now know for certain that pairs with teams to help them are very much more successful in rearing their young. Recently, though, it's been discovered that this form of cooperation is quite widespread among birds. Some species of wrens and woodpeckers and moorhens all use this form of cooperation under some circumstances, as indeed do some mammals.
So a lot of times what we'll call this is we might call it cooperative breeding. And so in cooperative breeding, you'll have several individuals that are helping take care of the offspring. Helpers at the nest is usually specifically referring to these juveniles that will help their parents raise offspring. And so you might wonder, how could something like that evolve if individuals that are foregoing reproduction to help their parents raise offspring, unless their fitness actually is pretty high, which would mean that they get a lot of indirect fitness. So this would have to be something that would arise through kin selection. Now, these data from birds are trying to show us the correlation between the evolution of cooperative breeding, cooperative care, and the level of promiscuity that a species has. So think about it this way. If that Florida scrub jay is going to help its parents raise siblings, the benefit to cost ratio has to favor that. And part of that ratio, remember, was relatedness. And so if relatedness is pretty high, then it's more likely that you're going to evolve through kin selection. If relatedness is very low, the behavior is unlikely to evolve through kin selection. Now, if we come back here and we ask, well, what's the connection then between this cooperation and level of promiscuity? Remember when we were calculating degree of relatedness, and we said you are 50% related to your full siblings. You are 25% related to half siblings. So let's just imagine that you have a mom and a dad, scrub jay, and they maintain that pair bond year to year to year. So a juvenile that is helping them raise offspring is helping them raise full siblings. If one of those parents dies or leaves, this juvenile is now helping its parents raise half siblings, and those half siblings are only 25% related to it. So now the benefit has to be much higher because the relatedness is lower. So the idea is we expect to see this kind of cooperative behavior evolving in those types of species that engage more in monogamy as opposed to a highly promiscuous mating system where individuals would likely be helping parents raise siblings that are less related to them. We see the cooperative behavior in the orange lines. We're also seeing the degree of ancestral promiscuity. If you look at where most of these orange lines are, you see that the green dots are fairly small. That represents a low level of promiscuity. And then over here, for instance, on this top part area where you don't see a lot of cooperative behavior and you see a lot of these large green dots, a lot of promiscuity, no cooperation. So we tend to see monogamy and less promiscuous mating systems preceding the evolution of helping behavior. The Greenbeard effect was a mathematical analysis that was a modeling that was done by Alan Grafin, who is a student of Richard Dawkins. Remember when we looked at our game theory and we said that if you're in a population of individuals that some are selfish and some are cooperators, then the evolution of cooperation works if there's a high degree of probability that you will be in a group with other cooperators. But it probably won't evolve if there's a probability that the individual that you're going to interact with is actually going to be selfish. So when they did these models of the evolution of cooperation, they had to incorporate probability. What Grafin was trying to do here is ask the question, but what if the allele for altruism doesn't have to just play the odds? What if you have this altruistic allele that can identify whether or not an individual is related to you, and then you can direct care to that individual? Kind of like what we saw with the experiment on humans and cooperativity. And then the other thing that Grafin came up with in his model was that in order for helping behavior to evolve, we don't have to have a super high relatedness. So like in the scrub jay, we had 50% and they were helping, and the higher it was, the more they helped. What Grafin's model did was said helping behavior can evolve if you can direct your helping behavior to individuals that are more closely related to you than the average individual in the population. So it's kind of lowering that threshold a little bit if they don't have to be highly related to you, but they do have to be more related to you than someone you would just randomly choose out of the population. So if I randomly choose in a population and I'm 10% related to individuals in the population, if I can direct my helping behavior to someone who's 15% or 20% related to me, I still do better than if I behave selfishly. And so that's what the Greenbeard effect was looking at. And he called it the Greenbeard effect because he then turned around and said, what if you could identify them? And so he kind of imagined, what if individuals who are altruistic or who are related to you, you have a green beard and they have a green beard. So you could identify them and you can direct your helping behavior towards them. One of the systems that is used to exemplify this model is Dictyostelium. Remember, Dictyostelium is part of the slime mold group that you learned about in Bio 2. And what happens is they form these amoeba-like structures that move across the forest floor, and they can reproduce asexually for a while. And then when its conditions start to get bad and it's time for them to maybe go to a new area, they will start putting out chemicals where a bunch of the amoeba will come together and they'll form like this mass. And then as part of this mass, a stalk grows. But the stalk cells do not get to reproduce. They just form this structure. Then there's like a capsule that forms at the top of that. And that structure actually makes the gametes that are going to go into the next generation. So the stalk doesn't get to reproduce. All the cells that make up the stalk, they don't get to reproduce. Only the ones that are up at the capsule. You're being sort of altruistic to be part of the stalk because you're not going to reproduce, and the capsule cells will. When they do genetic studies and look at relatedness, that the cells that make up the stalk are much more closely related to the cells that do get to reproduce than they would be to some randomly chosen cell that you would find in the forest floor. So probably through some chemical identification, they send out these chemicals, they find one another, and so individuals that are more related to one another do find one another, and then they cooperate. The idea of group selection has always been somewhat problematic for evolutionary biologists because it's always been questioned if an individual group can do better at the expense of the individuals that make up the group. Is that something that can evolve? And so traditionally from the very beginning, people were pretty against the idea of group selection and said, nope, it's kind of like the Dawkins idea. It's got to be the selfish gene or it's just not going to work. And Simpson came up with this model and this idea that looked at whether or not selection could work at a slightly different level, and could things evolve that would actually benefit the group that might be beneficial to the individual or not. So what this first line here is saying is it might be mutually beneficial. So being part of the group does better and the individuals in the group also do better. But what if it's actually altruistic? So what if you could do better off on your own and behaving selfishly as an individual, but the groups themselves do better under this altruistic model? And so again, can cooperation evolve when the benefit is actually to the group? We look here, we start off with a bunch of individuals. Some are cooperative, some are selfish, and this is basically 50-50 here. And then we're just going to randomly put groups together. So they're not related to one another. We're just going to randomly put them in groups. And they've essentially created all the different types of groups that you would see. So we've got 3 individuals here that are all selfish. And then in these 3, we have 1 individual within the group is selfish, 1 individual is cooperative. Then we have 2 individuals cooperative. And then on the far right, they're all cooperative. The reproduction of individuals within that group are going to depend on the makeup of the group. So if you are in a group of all selfish individuals, you don't do very well. So each individual within this group had 2 offspring, and that's what we see here. So if we look within the group, right here within this group, the cooperator actually isn't doing as good as the selfish individual. So they're not doing quite as good being part of that group as the selfish individuals within the group. And we could see this all the way across. It's the same thing. Same thing here. Again, the cooperators aren't doing quite as good as the selfish individuals within the group. And then here we have all cooperators. Now, if you are in a cooperating group, then everybody does really well. So not only does your group do better, but each individual in the group does better. So when they do a model like this and they add them all together and then they throw the gene pool back together again and then go back and count how many cooperative alleles do we have and how many selfish alleles do we have, we actually see that the cooperative allele is now at 0.56. So it has increased in frequency. So even though within these groups, the selfish individuals were doing better, because cooperative groups do better, that cooperative allele actually can increase in frequency. So it is possible. We call this the Simpson's paradox. The conditions under which Simpson's paradox works are pretty restrictive, so we don't expect to see it a lot, but at least theoretically it is possible, and it probably has occurred on some occasions. These data are from tribal humans, and basically they gave them a game to play as well, and they gave them like these honey sticks. They said, if you cooperate with everybody in your group, we're going to clump the resource together and everybody will actually get more. But if certain members members of the group don't cooperate, then you're going to get less. And so if you think that you're in a group where everybody's going to cooperate, you'd probably do better cooperating because you would get more. But if you're in a group where you think that a lot of individuals are not going to cooperate, then you probably are maybe not going to do as good if you cooperate, and maybe do better if you're selfish and just hang on to the honey stick you already have, because you have to give up your honey stick to put it in the big pot at the end. They go back and they calculate the variance in cooperation, comparing it back to what would happen if you just behaved randomly. And the variance in cooperation looks at the differences that you see between the groups. So if all cooperated to exactly the same extent, that'd be 0. If some individuals cooperated a whole bunch and others cooperated like not at all, then this would be a big number. So the differences between individuals in the level of cooperation. They looked at between bands and within bands. Within the band, right here, within a group, you're seeing much less variation in cooperation. So everybody in that group behaved more similarly to one another in their level of cooperation. When they looked at between bands, so from one band to another, and asked the individuals from band A, do they behave similar to individuals from band B? The answer was not so much. There's more variation there. So you're more likely to behave like individuals within your band and more maybe differently from individuals that are from other bands. And so this kind of gives a little bit of that idea that selection is working a little bit differently between these two levels, the within band and the between band level.